Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, Literacy Improvement in Practice, Excellence for All. Very honored to have Dr. Alicia Bruneau with us today, as well as some panelists from school districts around the country who are doing improvement science in their work, and thrilled to share their story with you today and maybe take a couple of questions. So in any improvement science approach to change, it does take a village, and we're thrilled that today we actually have three panelists. I'm going to introduce them now, and then I'm going to let them take a little bit of a screen break. But I just want you to know what's coming up. We're thrilled to invite a superintendent, an assistant principal, and a teacher who are each using improvement science in their respective arenas to better the work and system for the children in which they serve. And so allow me to first introduce you to Dr. Stephanie Downey Toledo. She is the superintendent of Central Falls School District, just north of Providence, Rhode Island. So any of you hoping to hear a nice Boston, Rhode Islandish accent, maybe get your hopes up, but I don't think it's too thick of an accent. But again, to have a superintendent speak about improvement science is going to be a joy. We also have Nichelle Wimbush, the assistant principal at LaGrange High School in Troup County, Georgia. Thrilled to have her today and hear through the school lens of how improvement science is improving outcomes for her students. And then also, probably from down the hall from Ms. Wimbush, we have Becca Davis. She's an ELA teacher, a ninth grade teacher at LaGrange High School, also in Troup, Georgia. Thrilled to have the three of you with us, and you are welcome to turn off your screens now and take a little bit of a screen break as we get to, I'll call it the main event. And remember, chat box is still open. So in this improvement science approach to change, the implementation is a key focus, whether you are in the classroom, the district office, or the boardroom. And after all, the goal of improvement science is to learn what works, for whom, and under what set of conditions, right? So learning that something works is critically important, but learning how to get it to work reliably is just as critical. So today, we will hear about from a superintendent, classroom teacher, assistant principal, on how their attempts to design systems in a more efficient and effective way is serving all students. But I do not say the words improvement science without picturing my colleague, my mentor, my text buddy, and a member of our academic advisory board member, Dr. Alicia Bruneau. Just to set the stage, who is Dr. Alicia Bruneau? In addition to being a co-founder of the Improvement Collaborative, Alicia is an educational expert specializing in how to apply the science of improvement. She began her career as a bilingual teacher in Denver Public Schools, and then in New York City, working to improve outcomes for students who speak a language other than English. Now, she pursued a specialization in improvement science, and he has spent many years adapting these methodologies for education at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. She co-authored their seminal book, Learning to Improve, How America's Schools Can Get Better at Getting Better. She remains extremely active in the field of improvement science. And just years ago, I was extremely fortunate to take a course that was offered out in California. So a guy who lives in Philly having to go to the beach in December, I was not mad about it. But a course through the Improvement Collaborative where we got to get really hands-on with this work. And so I am thrilled to mute myself and introduce everyone on the webinar to Dr. Alicia Bruneau.
Thanks, Matt. That's an awesome introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen and have the chat up. Well, welcome everyone. It's super exciting to be talking to this national group of folks that are all interested in readings coming from different parts of the country, coming from different parts of the system, and we get to talk about improvement, which is reading and improvement, and the intersection there is probably one of my favorite improvement topics. So thank you for having me today on the webinar. So my job today is going to be to do, I would think of a little bit of more of the boring part. So I'm going to try to motivate, like, what is this idea of improvement science, and what's really different about it from a sort of a big ideas perspective. And then I actually think the fun part will be to talk to people who are actually trying to do this in practice, because we all know that that is where the rubber hits the road. And so that's what we're trying to do over this period of time. So this word improvement is one that I would venture a guess that all of us in education use on a regular basis. It's in who we are as educators that we are working on improvement. And so that's something I think that holds us all together. But I want to add to it today is this idea that there is a science of improvement. So there's actually something that we know about organizations that are actually really good at improvement, and what can we pull and draw from that science of improvement to help us get wherever it is that we're trying to go in our improvement efforts. And so that's what we want to talk about. Just as an aside, to get the jargon out of the way, a lot of people use the words continuous improvement. I would think of continuous improvement and improvement science as synonyms. So whatever you want to put in that sort of bin, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So improvement at its very nature, whenever you're talking about any kind of improvement, begins with a recognition that there is a gap between your vision for what you're trying to do and what's currently happening, right? So where improvement gets this energy is from this sort of dissatisfaction with the current reality and this holding a bigger, bolder vision for what it is that you're trying to do. And this, when you think about, we're here talking about reading, right? What is your vision for reading, either at the classroom, school, or district level, and then facing it also to the current reality of what you're able to do, right? And holding that tension and naming those gaps is the heart and the birthplace of what we mean by improvement. So you name the gaps, but then the question is, well, what do we do about it? Because in a lot of ways, this idea that we recognize that there's a gap is not entirely new, right? That is something that, if you think broadly on the field of education, we've been doing for a great period of time. And we have some kind of default gap closing strategies that we usually turn to as leaders and as educators. So one is we buy a new program and we roll it out, right? We look for the silver bullet and we roll it out. Sometimes probably one of our biggest ones is that we train, right? So, if we have a problem, there's a gap, it must be because people don't know. So we'll institute a new training program. We all went through a phase in which accountability was it, right? Let's give extra rewards to folks that are doing well, and let's, draw attention to those who are not. And we've tried just the whole muscle it, try harder, get the hero to close those gaps as strategies. And each of these strategies, I think, has a role in the improvement of outcomes in education, but they haven't been on their own entirely successful at closing the gaps between the current reality and what we're trying to do. And so what we're trying to do in an improvement science approach, it is the science of how organizations close gaps. And it turns out that there are organizations that have gotten really good at closing gaps. And we can learn a lot about how they organize their change efforts in order to actually do that. And at least from my perspective, when I first encountered this idea of the science of improvement almost a decade ago, I was super excited about this idea. I actually encountered it in healthcare, not in education. But this idea, I had been trying all of the strategies I could think of as a teacher and then as a leader in a school to really close the gaps for my kids. And this idea that there was actually an approach, there was something that was known about how to do this. It wasn't just something I could try to do, but there was an actual way to do it, was something that was really excited for me as I thought about that. And as it turns out, it actually shifts a lot if you start to look into the science improvement about how you organize change efforts. And what organizations that are really good at this do is they use organizational learning in order to close those gaps. So they basically say, well, we have this gap because we don't know how to do better. And so we need to learn our way into a better way of working. And to motivate this just a little further, there was this study I came across a number of years ago, and this is in the field of healthcare. This came out in the year 2000. It was a 2000 paper. And if you look at this chart, on the left-hand side is a number of clinical procedures that you may or may not recognize. I don't recognize all of them, that were established in the literature. And in the literature, in that middle column is the date, the year upon which they established that this is actually a good treatment for a particular healthcare condition. And then you see all the way over on the right-hand side is the rate of use today, right? In this case, in 2000. So even after 15, 20 years, you can see that even though we knew what needed to happen in healthcare. It was an entirely different thing to figure out how to get it to happen in the day-to-day of doing work. And I think this is a really, really important distinction, the difference between knowing what needs to happen and knowing how to get it to happen is something that's a really important distinction. And it's a particularly important, I think, in reading, because we have quite a good science of reading. Of all of the things that we do and don't know in education, we have a great deal of knowledge about reading, but there's a big gap between what we know and what we're able to put into practice on a regular basis. And part of that comes from is that we've underestimated the how hard the how is. And this is probably something that this audience knows, right? Because we're an audience mostly of practitioners. And we know that it's not enough to just know what needs to happen for somebody to come along and tell us that. You operate in really complex systems. And the task of figuring out how to get something important to happen in a complex system is just as rigorous. It's just as intellectual. It's just as hard as figuring out the what, but we don't have the same apparatus as we put into play with when we try to figure out what actually works. And so underneath that observation that knowing what and knowing how are two different things is where the idea of an improvement science is really born for me. So what the idea of an improvement science is you do need to know what. It is important to have the science, but you also need to have the knowledge of how to make change in complex systems. And that where the sweet spot is to put those two things together, right? Is to not only know what needs to happen, but to also know how to make change. And so what I'm going to try to do today is kind of outline what goes in this yellow square. Like what is that? What are the implied shifts around how do folks who are able to successfully make change in complex systems, how do they do that? Like what are the key practices that they use? And so that's what we're going to work towards. Before we do so, though, I think that the conversation becomes, the teacher in me knows that the conversation becomes much more helpful if you're grounding it in something in your context that makes sense. So we're not just having an abstract conversation about improvement. So I want you to think for a moment, just for the sake of the next 20 minutes or so, of a gap or a problem that you're facing in your work. And I'll give you a minute to think about it in just a moment. But what I mean by that is like, so from a reading perspective, it could be like, okay, when I have this vision that I have all of my kids in my class are these amazingly engaged readers and they love reading. And right now I'm going to face into the current reality and know that there's 8 out of them that are actually more like compliant readers, right? I still have this moment that haunts me to this day from my first year of being a teacher, a bilingual teacher. And it was in the spring. And I had this realization that I didn't have a great data system like y'all have, but I had one of my 20 first graders who read on grade level in either English or Spanish, right, out of 20. So like that was the gap that just like fueled and haunted me in that particular period. So think about something like that. Or it could be something like, okay, I know that what I would really love is all 5th graders to learn how to read. And I know that I have 34% of my English learners that are still reading at emergency levels or are still reading far below grade level, whatever that is. Okay, so I'm going to give you just a minute to just name a gap, just one gap that is important to you as we dig into this conversation of what would it look like to improve. Okay, so can we get a couple of folks to just pop into the chat some, oh, thank you, Becca, for getting us started. Some of the gaps that you guys are thinking about. Stamina, yeah. Phonic coding, 1st grade, uber important. A couple other ones. You start to realize a lot of times that then a lot of us are working on the same gaps, right? As you go forward.
Well, and Alicia, there's probably a lot of people here. I received a private message that are also making the connection when we mentioned gap to power goals. You know, when we have an expectation of where we want a student to be reading at grade level, and yet we have the reality of where a student may be a little behind that. There are several little areas in which we would like to improve upon to get to that grade level. And yet likely there's no one foul swoop that gets it all done. It's a series of incremental changes, and not every change works the same for every student. So I think there's a lot of people starting to make connections around, am I doing improvement science even from the teacher level as I'm
Yeah.
trying to move a student through the ERLA or the ANEA levels?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't improvement science can, work on any sort of different level. I also love these ones coming in around high school, that, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that later, but you have to read to learn in high school. And so the gaps there in terms of where we should be are really important. Attendance also, yeah. And also different groups of students, right? So we know some students are reading well and other groups of students are not. Excellent. Okay, so hold those because we're going to kind of come back. We're going to come back to those gaps a couple of times as we start to explore what would it look like to take the science of improvement and apply it to a particular problem or a gap area. And then we'll hear from the panelists as we go on too around what it looks like for reals in real practice. So what I'm going to do in introducing the science of improvement is a huge field. It's a whole science. You can read, I'm still in the process of learning it and I have been for a long time. But I'm going to introduce it using the 6 principles, which come out of this book, Learning to Improve, that we wrote a number of years ago. And at the time when we wrote it, nobody was doing improvement science and education. It was a very new set of ideas. And since then, and for a whole host of reasons, folks have taken it up around the country and are working on different things using improvement science, from college access to math instruction to reading. But I'll describe a little bit what's common about the approach to how they're approaching that, talking a little bit through these 6 principles that we wrote about a number of years ago. So the first huge shift in an improvement science approach comes from where do we start when we try to solve a problem, right? So we're going to name a problem, but then what do we do? What do we do next once we name that there's a gap? And the first thing that we often do, and I will say myself included on any kind of improvement you want to talk about in my own life, is we have what we sometimes call a serious case of solutionitis, right? We're never short of ideas. It doesn't seem like, and we grab them up right as these different solutions, like a solution or a number of solutions almost always sort of pop to mind as you go forward. And the problem with this course is that a lot of times the solutions are not very well tailored to what is actually happening in practice. And sometimes you can actually see that in our schools, like when you look inside a school. I think it was Michael Fullen who at one point said that our schools end up looking like these Christmas trees, where it's just like a whole amalgamation of a bunch of different solutions that we've come up with over time, but not a very coherent way of organizing instruction and schooling. So instead of that, what's the alternative if it's not coming out of that? Well, instead of it, in an improvement science approach, we begin with a real humble stance to say, like, okay, well, we don't really understand what's going on here, because if we had the solution, we would have already solved this problem, right? So we start by being problem focused, by naming problems, and user centered. So one group of folks that we often don't go out and talk to is the students and families, and they have a ton of information about what is going on with whatever problem we're talking about. So can we go do empathy interviews? Can we watch what's happening? Can we go with a beginner's mind and start to see the problem anew from the user's point of view? If it's teachers that we're working with, can we talk to teachers? Can we try to understand how are the problems that we're seeing actually experienced by the people that we're intending to be helpful to, right? That we're intending to support. So that's where we'll often start, is with the user-centered approach, right? Try to understand it from a point of view. And a lot of times we learn that whatever solution we had in mind actually doesn't solve the problem that the users are having, right? It's coming from an assumption that we had. A second thing that we're going to do is try to see the system. And what we'll often call the first law of improvement science is that every system is perfectly designed to get exactly the results that it gets. So if we have a lot of students that are coming to 9th grade and they don't read fluently, we have a system that is perfectly designed to produce 9th graders that aren't reading fluently. And so what we want to do then is go see if we can figure out where is the leverage in the system? Where can we make changes that can actually get us to where we're trying to go? And it often does. And part of the reason I'm really excited about having here on the call a teacher, an administrator, and a superintendent on the call is it almost, almost never is just one of those levels, right? It's the interconnected workings of what happens in a classroom, in a school, in a district that actually produces the outcomes. And if we want to undo those, we need to see the unintentional ways that we are creating them together. And figure out how to get to a different set of outcomes. So seeing the system and taking a systems approach is super important in improvement science. And then lastly, we're going to attend to variability. So we are not going to treat problems as a one size fits all. We know students aren't all the same. We know classrooms aren't all the same. And there's a great deal of learning that we can take if we start to look at, well, what's different about what's going on in different classrooms, right? So if you're trying to work on something like, say, guided reading, it's for sure not the case that everybody's in the same place with that, but there's variation. And so how do we attend to that, learn from that, and figure out how to productively live in a system that we know has variation? So that's where we're going to start. I think as leaders, as teachers, as improvers, one of the real tricks in starting in that place is staying humble, is to realizing that we don't know how to close the gap, and to be curious and uncertain, and to go in with that point of view, right? To really ask questions like, I wonder why, right? Not going in with solutions and assumptions, but going in with these questions around like, well, why is there a gap? What could be all the different possibilities and the pieces that are contributing? So with whatever problem that you had named for yourself and in the chat, I want you to sort of practice this curiosity stance and write down a question, something you don't know, around that gap that you could go and learn about, right? Make sure it's an authentic question. It's something you're curious about, that you would want to know, that you're in that mindset of, I don't know what the system is that is producing this outcome, and see if you can write down a real authentic question. All right, Dolores got us started by popping something into the chat. So can we see some other practices? We're trying to practice accessing our own ignorance, right? Which is something that is important to do. So pop some questions, some authentic questions in the chat. Oh, that's an interesting question, Bob. Great. Great, Francis. Just questions like, what does it look like in classrooms? Like, could you go and see it and experience it? Yeah. The impetus to like go and see is something I think is really important in this curiosity. A lot of times people who make decisions about what we're going to do sit over here, but to actually go, interact, see what's going on is really important. I was working a couple of years ago with a group that was working on literacy, and they started in this way of trying to understand what was going on before jumping to solutions. And they originally the problem that they were facing was a 5th grade reading problem, that they were seeing these really low rates of 5th grade literacy. It was a rural area. And what they ended up doing through their investigation and looking at data and whatnot is they realized that the same students weren't reading at 5th grade. This may seem obvious to you, but it wasn't at the time to them, that they could see it in 1st grade. So then they had to work upstream. And so they ended up working in 1st grade in order to solve the problem. So if we don't accurately understand what's going on in the problem, then our solutions can't possibly make progress in those particular areas. And so that's really important. Excellent. Great. All right, so let's say that we have gone through a process on whatever problem we're working on, and we think we do really understand what's going on, and we have an idea of where a productive place would be to intervene. I would just say, because I was noticing a couple of things in the chat, like I also just really appreciate, as a teacher, I always felt like the people who were coming into my classroom had a bunch of assumptions about what was going on in the classroom, but they never just came in and asked, right? So I appreciate these questions that are really around, can we, before we have all these ideas about what we're going to do, can we go understand what's happening in classrooms? I think that's super important. All right, so we got to a place where we have one, right? And then the question becomes, well, we're going to need to introduce change, right? So improvement requires change. That's just part of the ball game. The trick is that not all change is actually an improvement. And it turns out that the way that we introduce change makes it really hard for us to do the kind of learning that I was talking about earlier as being really important to an improvement science effort. So here's what we usually do. We usually come up with some idea about what we need to do. And then some group of people in a committee, if I'm going to be overly glib about it, it's like usually around May, come up with some May, June, they come up with some plan and then we roll it out, right? We do it everywhere, all the time with everyone right now, because we're constantly in this mode of having to do things immediately. And well, what usually happens? Well, very rarely does this brilliant idea that we have play out the way we thought it would. Usually it works kind of somewhere, but not in other places. And we do very little learning around where it worked, where it didn't, why it worked, why it failed, right? But we're in this perpetual loop of like coming up with an idea, rolling it out, kind of works, and then we move forward, which is somehow is just in a lot of ways how we get these sort of Christmas tree looking schools with just an amalgamation of change ideas. And so what we're going to do in improvement science is something that's a little bit different, is we're going to try out ideas on a smaller scale so that we could learn quicker, right? So this is how science is produced on a regular basis and how a lot of development happens. Where you try it in one classroom, in one school, in one place with one kid, see if it works, sort out the ideas that don't work very well for you, and then only scale up the ideas that are really helpful as you go forward. And in order to do this, we have sort of the improvement science gives us two main methods that are helpful. One is an inquiry cycle so that we can try something out and see where it doesn't work, because we're going to learn the most from things that don't work, right? And we should expect, oh, I don't know, I would say like 7 out of our 10 ideas that we have to not work, but we need to make sure that we see that. And so we use a disciplined inquiry cycle in order to sort out our good ideas from the ones that are not as good. And we also use measurement, not as a gavel, but as a reflection of like, are we moving in the direction we want to? And this is another area where I think that we're in a good place with reading, because we have decent measurements that can give us regular feedback about whether things are improving in the field of reading, which is really helpful and is a huge resource as we go forward. And I think Matt mentioned this earlier, this is probably, if I had anywhere to start in improvement science, this is where I would start, is we use something called the model for improvement to discipline our change efforts. And what I love about it is how simple it is and how it applies to anything you want to improve from your personal life into change on sort of a national level. And what the model for improvement does is it has you ask 3 very specific questions to discipline your improvement effort. So what specifically are we trying to accomplish? What is it? Where are we trying to get to? What changes might we introduce? And why do we think that change is important? And how will we know when we try that change if it's actually an improvement? Right. And so there was one district that I was working with that just started an improvement science approach by continually asking these 3 questions in a meeting. I'm telling you, it actually works really well in a meeting. It's like, well, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? What are we trying to do? What's the change that we're proposing? And how will we decide if this is an improvement or not? And so the discipline of those 3 questions, and then adding with it an iterative cycle where you try things out and you learn by doing, not by talking, but by trying something and reflecting on how it works, is the engine that helps you learn your way into bigger and better outcomes to sort out your good ideas from the ones that don't work as well. So I want you to just try on a short level, just try applying these 3 questions around, you all had a vision. Could you make it a little bit more specific about what specifically would you want to accomplish? If you have some changes in mind, throw your changes out there, come up with 1, 2, 3, or 4, knowing some of them aren't going to be right. And then try to think about like, well, if that change was an improvement, how would you know? And so I'll give you about a minute to think and to try to take the questions and see what they look like when they're applied to something that really matters to you.
And while you're doing that, I'll just remind us that in about a couple of minutes, we have our panelists who are going to share their responses to these same 3 questions. in their arenas. So for those of you that are like holding that pencil, rubbing it against your chin, going, I'm not sure what this might look like in my venue, more support to come.
Love it. All right, I'm just going to end with one, if you're one last thought, well, actually two last thoughts, but if you were paying a lot of attention to the 6 principles, you'll notice I only covered 5. And to some of you that might be like, well, what about the 6th one? The 6th one is less about improvement science and is more about a way of working, which is the potential of networks to really accelerate learning. And for those of you who work in a school district, you actually work in a network, right? So a district is usually a network of schools. It's a whole different ballgame to try to get schools and organizations to work together in a network, but it can really, really, really accelerate what you can do. And so there's some emerging science about that and some folks that are trying to use improvement science, but structure it in a network to really accelerate the progress. And you can see, something like reading and a lot of the problems that y'all are putting in the chat, there's a lot of people who have very similar issues. So how could we work together and we could, work through different change. We'd have more change ideas. We could see how they work. And we'd have more people learning and a better possibility that we would discover something. So I'm going to kind of end there because I think, this is enough of the overarching theory of improvement science and how it solves problems. And I think the fun is in the actual application. So let's move to that next. I will say, as I kind of sign off, I have 2 hopes that I want to share with you. I would say hope 1 is in the field of improvement science that you find some itsy bitsy idea that's idea or method or that is helpful to you in your improvement journey, that helps you get closer to where you're trying to go from a reading perspective, that there's something you can borrow, beg and steal that's very pragmatic for you and helps you move forward. And then my second hope is what, I think about something like reading in this country and how important it is that we make progress in this area. And I think in a lot of ways, we've gotten a little complacent with the fact that we don't teach all kids to learn how to read. And the only thing I can possibly think of that's going to push that is if one of you in a classroom, in a school or a district gets it so every single kid learns how to read. Because I think if we could prove that that's possible in a place, then it starts to snowball an effort where it's like, okay, if this district can do it, maybe we can all do it. And that's the impetus for change as we think about making big change going forward. So I'm hoping that there's somebody who just digs in and does the work and figures out how to drive the number of kids who learn how to read, who don't learn how to read by 3rd grade down to 0. And then that pushes all the rest of us to bigger and better places. So those are my hopes as we go forward.
What a wonderful place to transition. Alicia's hopes. So moment in about 60 seconds, there's Dr. Toledo on the call right now. I'm going to give Dr. Toledo a chance to reflect on those 3 improvement questions. And one of the things I just kind of want us to listen in for is when we think about the scale or the granular level of where we're coming from these places. And I saw in the chat box that a couple people are thinking about how they would measure their success. And I just want to take a moment to think through, a lot of times in the world of education, we do often feel the push, the need, the requirement to measure all of our success against the state test. However, if I'm implementing the tiniest bit of change in today's ELA instruction, I'm a kindergarten teacher and I'm adjusting how I do my morning message, the state test will give me nothing about whether or not my change helped. And if it did, it would take a year to learn if that change even had an impact. So what I hope we're listening in for is not just the venues in which our 3 panelists are doing their change, but what they're specifically measuring or where their eyes are in the scope of those things, so that we have a much shorter cycle of knowing what's working to take things to scale. All right, Dr. Toledo, I think that was a 60-second buffer. I'm just going to cede the floor to you and let you share with our group today around those questions. What were you trying to solve in Central Falls, Rhode Island? What do you think are some of the changes that led to some success? And how do you know they're working?
Great, thank you so much, both Matt and Dr. Grunow. So my name's Stephanie Downey Toledo. I'm the superintendent of the Central Falls School District. We are an urban district in Rhode Island. Fun fact though about Central Falls, just so you can sort of picture this urban district, is at one point Central Falls was the most densely populated city in the US. So we've slightly lost that title, but all of our schools are within 1 square mile. So it is urban. We are 100% of our students receive free and reduced lunch. And yet I can walk to all 6 schools at any point. So it's a really neat context. When I came to the district 4 years ago, just so you sort of know what we're doing with ARC, they had adopted bits and pieces of the program, but didn't have the funding to go all in initially. And so we were thrilled that through a grant in the 1920 school year, which we all know now is the COVID year, we were implementing ARC Core for the first time. So a lot of my reflections are also about how we did this work despite the chaos around us. And I'm so proud of our team, every classroom for how they did that, including every student. So in terms of the framework that Dr. Grunow is sharing, I think my focus was being problem-centered and user-focused. We have an incredible, diverse population in Central Falls. It's a largely immigrant community. So I often share with people that of the 180 school days, we're enrolling kids on about 170 of those days. And so it's important because when you're looking at data in school pace, for example, the numbers may not change, but it could be that 3 students left and another 3 came. Or I know initially when I would look and say, you know, there's kids who don't have a level, what's going on? And then I'd learn they just enrolled. And so being user-focused, student-focused was really critical to our improvement work to figure out what's working and for which students, and then reflecting on where do we need to actually like shift our practice because there are patterns that the data is showing us that certain students were not benefiting. So to sort of zoom out to the 3 questions again, what are we trying to accomplish specifically? This year, our focus was on how do we ensure that multilingual learners are benefiting from ARC Core in the same way that their monolingual English-speaking peers were, because we did see our monolingual English students take off with ARC Core, but didn't see the same for our students who are multilingual. So I'd say that was specifically what we were trying to accomplish. But of course, everything in the last, few school years has been within this COVID context. So it was also about not only figuring out how to better serve our students who are multilingual, but to also accelerate all the gap closing that we were working to do, given the impact of distance learning during the pandemic. So that was a little bit of what we were focused on: multilingual learners, accelerated growth, and fidelity to implementation through the COVID context. So what changes might we introduce? Well, from my seat, despite often wanting to go into every classroom and do a levels check with all 3,000 kids, and trust me, Monique our coach had to coach me out of that a lot, because once a teacher, always a teacher. I needed to more think about what are the change ideas in each of my schools, in each classroom. And so this is a little bit meta, but my change idea was to be more on top of all the change ideas. And so one change idea that really stuck was I created a simple spreadsheet that became our change idea tracker. And I know this is a luxury, but because of this grant and some of the ESSER funds that we each got, we had more people supporting us this school year than was typical. So a principal might be working with their school-based art coach, and then we had our district art coach, and then there's me, and then there's our person who focuses on MLLs, and we're each talking to a principal about a change idea, but maybe they even get lost on like, who did I have what conversation with? So just a simple change idea of, hey, if every person on our literacy leadership team puts their change idea in to this tracker, what they, and sort of goes through these questions of, what am I trying to do? How am I going to measure change? And then a reflection piece. We each committed to putting that in there. And it was good for ourselves and our own process of improvement science, but then also made sure that all these people who wanted to support us knew what we were each focused on. So if an art coach, pops in for a coaching day, they could see how, Principal A had iterated from the previous month instead of it all being in, threads of emails. And so that's been really neat. And then each month we create a new tab, and the first column says, whether you are sticking with the change idea, iterating it, or starting with a new idea. So again, it's a little meta, but it was a change idea about change idea tracking. And that was really helpful too, because principals could see the work happening in the other schools. And to the point around networks, that was really beneficial, because even though we would come together monthly for the LLS Leadership Learning Series, I don't know if other districts are doing it, but highly recommend this. We, as the school and district leaders, had an opportunity to be coached and developed. And that has been really a big part of the transformation in Central Falls, to make sure that we are, again, being problem centered and coming together and sort of identifying each month what are the key problems, but also user focused, because the answer at this one monolingual school is not going to be the same as it is at our dual language school, which is also implementing our core in both languages. I could talk for hours about this stuff though, so I'll pause there, see if there's any questions.
And of course, if anyone has any questions, definitely feel free to put them in the chat box. But also, we've got our very own inquisitor, Alicia Greneau, ready with a follow-up.
Well, I just think it's such a fascinating story. And when I hear Dr. Downing talking about this, the way that she's talking about leadership is just so different than leadership as I experienced it, right? So in an improvement science approach, we assume that the people closest to the problem are the best situated to solve the problem. And at least where I worked when I was a multilingual teacher, nobody asked me what I thought my change idea was about how to solve the problem. Yet I sat very close to the problem on a regular basis. So just this idea that that she's interested, that you're interested in everybody's change ideas is really important. And then I also think about, like, when I watch leaders try to do this, that we almost only operate from two poles. One is I tell you what to do and you do it. And the other is everybody does whatever they want to do. But here you've got this middle ground where people are empowered to try and change ideas because we recognize they have important ideas, but the ideas can bubble up to each other's. So it's neither just like everybody does whatever they want and we don't learn from each other, nor is it I'm the one who controls all the ideas, but it's this like, oh shoot, if we were all learning all across this district and everybody was trying different things and somebody discovered something, then that would also impact somebody over there. Like, that's the real spirit of this idea that the organization is going to learn, right? But I think we struggle with these two poles between those two things. So I guess the thing that and maybe it's not yet because you're starting on this, but I am curious if you've had what is like the gold and very hard to get to have happen. Have you had change ideas move from one place to the other where like somebody grabbed it and it starts to change things?
We have. There's a really neat example. And I want to just note, I see the people in the chat asking for some specifics, so I'll speak to that too. One really powerful way that we saw one school move forward and then it was borrowed or implemented sort of at scale is that we had one school who started working really closely with families. And it was initially students who were still at Read to Me. And they were like, there's a lot of context. Again, we're enrolling kids every day, right? So it doesn't mean that they necessarily had been at Read to Me for a long time, but many families, are immigrating to the US and start in Central Falls. And so there was a need to meet those needs of students who might be diving in mid-year and need that extra support. And so we saw the students take off once we were also bridging the home school literacy connection. And we were running these workshops in Spanish, which was just phenomenal. We took some of that grant money and bought a ton of Amarillo books and just made sure that every student had Amarillo books to take home so that families could support in either language. And because of just seeing how that took off in one school, we implemented that across all of our elementary schools, and actually the middle school too, because again, some students are coming with interrupted formal education and they might be a 7th grader who is starting at Léame a mí. And so we were so thrilled that that has helped us almost eliminate any yellow Amarillo reader district wide. And we were looking at a few hundred just a few months ago. So that's a powerful example of how we learned from someone's small change idea and then enabled it to benefit exponentially more students and families. There are a few technical questions. I just wanted to say that, who enters the change ideas in the tracker? We use the Google Suite. So it's a shared Google spreadsheet. So each person is responsible to enter their own change idea and update it. And I'm happy to take our personal information out and just sort of make a template and share it maybe with Matt or my coach Monique to share with the network.
Yeah, we typically do a nice follow-up, and that might be something that we could share with other people in the panel. But you're starting to talk about some of these pieces that are done at the school level, and I would love to invite Assistant Principal Wimbush and teacher Becca Davis into the conversation as well. They both work at the same high school, but Ms. Wimbush, I'd love to maybe open the floor to you for a second and think through, now that we've kind of heard what's happening in this school district level, what's the problems or the challenges that you saw yourself addressing in your high school, and then maybe what did you do about it, and how did you know the change was an improvement? And feel free to go between you and Becca Davis as you see fit, but I want to give the floor to you.
So I actually started our program from the district office. I was the secondary literacy coordinator, and what we did was we did a feasibility study, or we did a I can't think of the word right now. We did a inventory, or I cannot think of the word, I'm sorry. We looked at what resources we had in the system and what we were lacking. And so from a secondary standpoint, it was, okay, obviously in high school, kids get to us and the buck stops here and they can't read. So what do we do to fix it? So we started looking at ARC, and at the time we had a grant. We have this large literacy grant from our state, and LaGrange High School had the grant. Well, the next year I became an assistant principal at the school. And so I started working closely with our teachers. And I think from an administrative standpoint, the biggest thing that I can tell an administrator or someone who is on a leadership level is that you are not the expert, your teachers are. So you have to listen to what they say they need and get them those things. At the same time, when you look at implementing any program, you have to do it with fidelity. And in order to do it with fidelity, you have to be able to support those teachers. And that means professional development. And so my teachers said they didn't want a one and done, specifically Becca. She didn't want a one and done. She wanted someone to come in and be there with her. So when we started this process, I listened to what they said, which was, we don't want something that's totally different. We want to be able to integrate this into our curriculum. So we kind of tweaked what ARC was asking for us to do. And then it became, well, Becca is teaching our communications class, which was sort of like our Read 180 class. And let's work with that. Well, we know the pandemic came and that kind of interrupted things. And so last year, at the end of the year, Becca had started to work with our consultant, Shadana, who is fabulous. And Becca said, well, I really want to hone in on some things, and I really want to see if I can make this work. So what we did this year was we went to a block schedule, which meant that students would not be getting ELA all year. But we knew that we had students who needed ELA all year. So what we did was we taught communications the first semester, and we taught on level ELA the second semester. We kicked Read 180 out, and we used American Reading Company's their lower level programs. So we bought Becca all those things, and Shadana started coming in to do some coaching with her. And what in my mind, the vision was, if I can get these students small group instruction, and so I got professional development for not only Becca, but also her parapro, because I think that that's key also. If you're gonna do small group instruction in a high school, everybody that teaches those kids, that touches those kids every day, should get the same level of professional development. Oftentimes paraprofessionals do not. And so we got small group instruction happening with both teachers in those classrooms first semester heavily, and then second semester they did on grade level instruction, but we still use small group. So I'll let Becca talk about what was in her classroom.
We noticed that the problem in our class was that most students were not reading on grade level, and many of our students didn't want to read. They weren't very engaged in reading. So we had to make it to where we just tried to make it fun for them if we could, as much as we could for a ninth grader. But the small group was the best thing. We noticed that when we did do small group in the classroom, if we had a small group table with the kids and the other kids were reading by themselves, the kids just did not want to participate with their peers listening while they're supposed to be reading. So we're fortunate to have an empty classroom across from us. And so we kind of made that like our small group room. My parapro made it look cozy as she could. And we would go in there, and while she was monitoring the independent reading, I would be in there with our small group. And it was just a huge difference with how much the kids were opening up and wanted to participate or wanted to read out loud. And they were asking questions about the text, and we would be like, oh, we don't know the answer. So we'd Google something like about sea monsters. And then some days my parapro would take a different small group, and the next day while I monitored the independent reading. So it was great the small group setting was the best thing because our kids felt more comfortable. Now that we're like in our second semester and we're reading grade level text, we have a lot more kids who are more confident to read out loud and to answer questions and come up to the board and write on the board for us. I mean, it really did increase their confidence with the small group and worked well.
It looks like in the chat box, you're getting a lot of praise for giving some PD to those paraprofessionals. Go ahead, Ms. Wimbush.
So another thing so Becca and I speak a lot. We speak often because I happen to be one of her administrators that supervises her. But one thing that we talked about when we started this program, and a lot of people in high school, the key is you have to remember that high school teachers are content specialists. They are not reading specialists. And so you have to find some flexibility in that. And also that high school students, like Becca said, they don't like to read. So when we talked about the independent reading, we had to take what American Reading Company was suggesting and make it LaGrange. It can't look the same that it looks everywhere else in your building. And I am very big on what my teachers want is what I ask for. I don't ask for anything else because my job is to support what they need so that they can support what our students need. And in Becca's case, she's had a lot of growth this year. That happened because as an administrator, I didn't know best. They knew best. All I could do was utilize the pot of money that I had, give them the time that they needed, schedule like I knew they needed to schedule, and support any initiative that they needed. It's all about support. It's not about control. And so when you can support, and we met with Shadana this year at the end of the year, and they asked, well, how many days do you want? And it's so funny because I looked at Becca and I said, well, how many days of PD do you want? Because it doesn't matter. But the more confident Becca became and her paraprofessional became, the more confident those kids became. And so to see the students grow, now we're thinking about, okay, so I'm hiring another teacher. Let's try to do this with 2 teachers next year. So we're thinking about scaling. We're not scaling huge. We're not scaling across the district. We're scaling within our building to what we know we need. And hopefully our hope is that our ELA end of course test is 11th grade. Well, if I can get these 9th graders who were not reading on grade level, foundational reading skills, and have them comfortable with their reading and writing 9th and 10th grade, by 11th grade, when they take those tests, the same students that didn't do well on the 8th grade state test will do much better in the 11th grade.
Yeah, I was actually just putting something in the chat box, and I'll share it quickly before I toss it over to Alicia. I do see the time. We're gonna wrap up in about 3 minutes and 50 seconds. But I think your role, Ms. Wimbush, as you're saying, Becca was out there doing the work, but you were able to allocate the resources based on the data that was at your disposal. And the person who uses the data to allocate the resources, be them humans, be them cash, be them materials, is an extremely important and essential person on that improvement team. And it is not in addition to, it's not someone who's not on the improvement team, but Becca, as the classroom teacher, cannot simply put more money into the classroom or bring a paraprofessional in at a certain time of the day. That's something that you do need someone else on the team to kind of sponsor that action. Dr. Grunow, I want to give you the chance to share anything with the troop team or anything else that you're thinking of.
No, I mean, my primary reaction to this, the first time I heard about this project, is just that Becca is working on like one of the most important problems in the nation at the moment, right? So, I mean, imagine if you can get this class of 9th graders to read, and what a life-changing opportunity that is for those students, and that how many other high schools there are in the world that need to know the answer to this question. Like, how do you actually, like, what's the practical, like, how do you actually put that into practice? And I love how Michelle was talking about it, because in the end of the day, like, there's this insight around they need a safe space so they can read. That's a huge insight. That's a very, very important user-centered insight. The high schoolers need a safe space so they can learn how to read. That somebody else can start to take some of these changes and put them into their context, and it's not going to look the same. The safe space might not be in the same spot, but that there's the idea and that learning that you can build on as you launch your improvement efforts is really important. So I'm just like, figure this out, Becca, and tell us how you did it, because I think that'll be a nice leg up as other folks across the country try to figure out how to solve a problem that's super duper important.
Absolutely. And when you find the things that work, don't keep them secrets, right? Taking things to scale is essential. So I want to take this moment at 5:03 here in the Eastern time zone to thank our panelists, to thank Dr. Grunow, and to thank Dr. Toledo, and to thank Miss Davis and Miss Wimbush for being a part of our afternoon and for sharing their wisdom. This is a time to work and learn, but I also hope that everyone that's here is using it as a time to network and learn, and maybe write down the names of people that you saw in the chat box that are near you. They're doing something similar to you. Feel free to find these people on Twitter or on LinkedIn, or talk to your ARC coach and say, hey, any chance you can give me an email address for Dr. Toledo, for Ms. Wimbush, and we can make those connections. So again, thank you so much for joining. This is another 60 seconds for me to remind you that we do have another webinar, there's the word, coming up in a month. If you are able to, please join us on May 19th for another Voices from the Field webinar titled Making Equitable Systems a Reality. In addition to inviting some superintendents who are ARC users, we are thrilled to be able to invite Dr. Pedro Noguera as well as Dr. Irvin Scott to be a part of that learning. So I hope that you will join us. And again, thanks to all of us for being here. Go forth and have a phenomenal what's left of your Thursday. Thanks again, panelists.